Okay, everyone, now as an extension to the previous video in which we talked about how you validate numerical input, I have a little extension I want to show you. So this is if you want to take it a little further. So in our previous video, we talked about how you validate a range of numbers. So if you ask a user to enter a number from 1 to 10, it's making sure that that number that they enter is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in the right range. Now there's a hole in that though. There's something still not quite completely correct about that, in the sense that a user could enter something that's not a number, say like just a random piece of text, like yes or no, and the computer would get fooled by that, or you would get an error by that. If you try to convert that to an integer, you actually get a syntax error. So another layer of checking, another layer of validation that we might want to put in is to check whether the user actually inputted some digits, which would be a number, or they enter just some random text, which we would need to kick that back and say, hey, you got to enter a number. So I have a demo here that there's also a link to on the Classroom stream that illustrates that idea. Okay, so you have kind of the same starting point. You have your flag variable is valid input, which is false initially, and you have your user input variable, which is empty string. You have your while loop, while not is valid input, and so this I'm using kind of that other form. You could also say is valid input equals false. You could also say it like that. So we read in the input, and the new stuff actually comes here in the checking part. So when you're doing the validation, what I did here is I put in another layer of validation to first check whether what the user entered is something that consists of just digits. In other words, if it represents a number, or if there's other letters or symbols thrown in along the way. And in which case, if there are, we'd want to kick it back and say, hey, you got to enter a number, not just random text. So I have another layer of validation. So that means these so-called nested if statements. So when you have conditionals or other structures that are one inside the other, like if you have an if statement and then another if statement inside that, that's called nesting. So I have another layer here where I check first if the input is a number. Okay, so this line right here, this conditional line 19, if user input dot is numeric. Okay, what's this guy right here? Well, Python, conveniently enough, has a built-in function that will check whether or not a piece of data consists of just digits, which means it's a number. And there's a function to check that. If there were other random pieces of text like A or Z or B or letters or symbols thrown in, then it would be false. Okay, now here's something also interesting. The way we're calling that function, a little bit different from the way we've learned about functions previously. When you have a function, usually you put the name of the function, then a parentheses, and then whatever uh, parameters or data you need to give the function to do its work. Here, we were seeing a slightly different way of calling that function. This is called a dot notation for calling a function. So an alternative way that sometimes you'll see for calling a function is to put the thing that you want to check first. So I'm using user input, I'm checking that to see if it's numeric. And then I put a dot, then I put the name of the function I want to use to check it. So this is, sometimes you'll see this notation for calling a function. At first, it might seem kind of arbitrary when you use this so-called dot notation and when you use kind of the more traditional way. But again, just like anything else in a new language, once you kind of get more experience, get the hang of it, then you'll start to understand when to use one versus the other. Okay, but this is numeric function will check whether or not user input, so whatever the user typed in, it'll check whether or not it consists completely of all digits, in which case it'll be true, or whether there's some symbols and letters and other stuff thrown in there, in which case it'll be false. Okay, so my first conditional, my first layer of checking is to check whether or not what the user input is actually numbers. Okay, if it isn't, so that's what the else is. So if this turns out to be not true, so if it's false that the user entered stuff with just exclusively numbers, so if there's digit or symbols or letters or other stuff thrown in there, then it's going to go to the else, and it's going to print, you must enter a number. Please try again. And to go back and re-execute the loop. Okay, so the first layer of checking is to see whether or not the user input actual number. Okay, then inside that, then I have the part to check, well, if it is a number, then let's check to make sure it's in the right range. So then I convert it to an integer. Okay, here's our more traditional function call. We put the name of the function and then the stuff we wanna pass in. Check whether, then I convert it to an integer and I check whether or not that number is in the right range. Okay, so I check my range in this line, line 25. That's my conditional. Okay, if it's in the right range, I print a message to let the user know about that, and then I print out what their value is. And then I switch my flag to true, so that now we exit the loop. Okay, otherwise, we know it's a number, but it's not in the right range, so then we print a message to tell them that. Okay, so notice like when I have these so-called nested conditionals, so notice how like this conditional here is inside this bigger one here. Notice how it's indented some more, so it knows it's inside this bigger conditional. So when you have one conditional or one structure inside another, that's called nesting. And that's like another layer. So it has to go through the first layer, check first to check whether it's a number. And then if it's a number, then it checks whether it's in the right range. If it's not a number, then it says you got to enter a number and goes back in the loop. Okay, so this demo code is available on the stream. Take a look at it because it shows you kind of a little bit more robust, a little bit more flexible input validation check.